All right, so good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. So good to have you all here today. So as I mentioned, my name is Geneva Dampere. I am the Director of Strategy and Operations for the Teaching and Learning Center at UNCF. And very, very excited to have our last and final TLC talk for this academic year. So kudos to everyone for participating, and shout out to all of you who are wrapping up your academic semesters and graduating your students. Very, very proud that we have closed out another year. So today we will be speaking on putting culturally responsive teaching into practice, equity-minded digital teaching strategy guide. So we are joined today by Ray Keith and Sarah Kinnison from Achieving the Dream. So two of my favorite and wonderful colleagues and collaborators across the higher education canon. They will be presenting today on some of the guides that they have been working on that have been published in the past couple of months as it relates to culturally responsive teaching. So very, very excited to have this presentation and to have them on board to speak to you all about that topic.
Thank you, Geneva. And we'd also like to thank Yuriko and UNCF for inviting us to the TLC Talks. We'd like to start with a land and labor acknowledgement. I'll start with the land acknowledgement. Achieving the Dream, whose offices are located in Silver Spring, Maryland, acknowledges that we live and work upon the stolen lands of the Piscataway Conoy Tribal Nation. We affirm and validate the history of the rightful past, present, and future inhabitants of the land. This would include the Akanohak Indian Tribe, the Assateague Peoples Tribe, the Nasuwewa Band of Indians, the Piscataway Conoy Confederacy and subtribes, and the Cedarville Band of Piscataway Indians, the Paukamook Indian Nation, and the Yokogaini River Band and Shawnee Indians. We acknowledge the thousands of tribal members in our community that are displaced from their own homelands and have moved to Montgomery County. As members of Achieving the Dream, we oppose oppression in all of its forms and seek to repair past injustices as we work to advance an equitable future with and for Indigenous people in Silver Spring and everywhere. Labor acknowledgement. This country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. This country is indebted to their labor and their sacrifice and must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations, the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed, and the enduring wisdom, strength, and hope that supports the forward movement and excellence of African Americans today. The key takeaways for today's session include how to intentionally affirm and validate students' diverse cultural backgrounds, lived experiences, and identities through culturally responsive pedagogy, implementing instructional strategies that ensure equitable educational experiences for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students, and creating educational spaces that holistically engage the whole student in the learning experience. In this session, we'd like to introduce you to Putting Equity into Practice Digital Learning Strategy Guides, specifically Culturally Responsive Teaching and Learning, co-authored by Ray and me and our colleagues, Dr. Rwanda Garth McCullough and Dr. Michelle Hampton. Throughout this presentation, we'll be sharing components and images of this guide with you, and we'll provide the link at the end of the session. But we wanted to briefly explain how it is structured. It starts with defining culturally responsive pedagogy. Next, it talks about founding scholars of the pedagogy, Drs. Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson Billings. Then each guide highlights how the strategies are connected to the adapted version of Zaretta Hammond's culturally responsive framework. Next, you'll see the specific strategies, benefits to students, faculties, and institutions, digital tools that can be used to enhance the instructional practices, practical ways to implement culturally responsive teaching, And then the guide includes interactive resources, pop-outs, and links that take you outside the guide to continue your learning as it relates to culturally responsive teaching. I will hand it over to Ray.
Thanks, Sarah. So within our guides, we have the umbrella of culturally responsive pedagogy, but within this pedagogical approach, we also want to highlight culturally responsive teaching, culturally affirming teaching and learning, and then culturally sustaining pedagogy, and how they're all connected in creating educational spaces where students can actually thrive versus survive based on cultural references that are implemented in the teaching practices. So here is an example of what you'll find in the guide as it relates to teaching and learning. Again, as Sarah mentioned, we'll have definitions and what that looks like in practice. And so one is validating, making sure the students really feel that they're validated in the spaces, that we're acknowledging their culture, their frames of reference as it relates to historically marginalized students, and making sure that their learning is more relevant and culturally responsive and effective to them in that classroom space. And then thinking about how culturally responsive can be comprehensive. And that really makes us think about how we're engaging the whole student in that learning space and recognizing that students, if they're in a math class, it's really about how we're engaging that whole student, not just seeing them as a math student, but also thinking about their outside lives that they bring and the cultural community wealth that they bring into that space as well. And then empowering students so that they can be more successful learners, that they see themselves as capable learners in that space, that they're developing this agency and self-efficacy, and then thinking about transformative ways that we can engage with students through teaching and learning practices that really address those inequities that many students who have marginalized identities and racialized identities have experienced in higher ed historically. And then creating these emancipatory spaces where students are learning that there isn't just a single truth, but that their own experiences are validated and affirmed in that space, and that they really can take some ownership in their learning and become co-constructors of knowledge in that space with the student, with their faculty members. And so, again, these are just some highlights of what culturally responsive teaching looks like in practice. And we'll go to the next slide. And then we have our culturally affirming teaching. And what does that look like? That's really about being intentional, being strategic, making sure that we're mitigating those potential racialized experiences that students might have in those classroom spaces, particularly based on their identities and their lived experiences, but also making sure that we're actually affirming those students' backgrounds and cultures, and upholding their identities with high regard, respect, and esteem. And through this approach, we're really creating these student learning spaces where their self-knowledge and their racial identities are affirmed. We're honoring their historical legacy and the contemporary contributions of racialized groups and communities in that space. And then we have our culturally sustaining pedagogy, and that really requires educators and institutions to sustain and maintain cultural ways of those communities of color in those spaces, making sure that we're uplifting and affirming their cultural wealth that they bring into that space, and really having a genuine focus on fostering students' sense of belonging, their intellectual and social and emotional well-being in those academic and work spaces. And again, this is really about how do we put into practice validating their racial identities, their ethnic identities, and their communities at the foundation of this work. And so we want to share 3 of the strategies from this particular guide, and then we're going to focus on two of those strategies as we go through the rest of our presentation. And so the first is accessing and activating culturally bound prior knowledge, and making sure that, when students come into that space, that we're embracing who they are, making sure that we understand that students don't come in as empty slates, that we're not just filling them as vessels, making sure that we're not being, the sage on the stage. Students do bring their own knowledge into that space. And how do we leverage that knowledge so that they can create a space that's inclusive, that truly allows them to authentically engage with the course content and the discipline? And then empowering students by using cultural references. And so again, we really want to think about how are their cultures being centered into the educational space? How are we creating opportunities for them to analyze and research topics that are really socially cultural perspective from their own social cultural perspective, excuse me, and that really provides them an opportunity to research topics that are of interest to them based off of their own cultural experiences and lived identities. And then thinking about this cultural information and how we're using that to engage their learning. And then our third strategy is fostering learning environments that validate cultural identity, knowledge, and experiences. And so how are we being intentional about creating those peer-to-peer learning opportunities, student-faculty relationships, creating spaces where students are being nurtured, also sharing power in that space. How are we creating space where students are being positioned as co-contributors and democratizing that space where it's not just, the faculty has all the information and students are just sitting and getting. How do we really create a space where students feel included, engaged, and invited to be liberated in that space? And then leveraging the community cultural wealth and the funds and knowledge that students bring into that space as well. And so here we want to think about accessing prior knowledge and how do we do that? So one is by creating assessment tools and being intentional about the types of tools that we develop to assess students' prior knowledge, making sure that we're creating these short assessments that determine the extent and accuracy of what students know and what they understand about these key concepts that you're teaching in your classes, and then thinking about multimodal ways of doing that. And so maybe you have multiple choice questions, you might have short answer questions, really taking a look at what do students know, but also where might there be gaps, and then how do we help students continue to learn in that space based off of their own prior knowledge. And so as we think about assessing prior knowledge, it's really not just about asking what do students know, but how do they know this information? And then really, how do we elicit what they know about these particular topics? How does it align with our course objectives? And then creating assignments that really highlight the main things, but also making sure that those assignments are being designed with a cultural context that really supports students bringing in their own learning, their own experiences, and then having faculty to use these assessments to inform their own instructional practices based off of students' prior knowledge.
So in the guide, we have these areas. Thank you, Ray. In the guide, we have these areas called putting it into practice. We really want to ask, how do we put this strategy, assessing prior knowledge, into practice? So especially at the beginning of the semester, we want to use low stakes assignments to keep aware of the knowledge that students bring with them, and particularly culturally bound knowledge that you can build upon to help them connect strongly to the course disciplinary information. And then throughout the semester, we continue checking in with students by using low stakes assignments to assess their knowledge and finding areas where they can use support. And so we're constantly getting to know our students, or consistently. And then in our guides, we also have how do you use digital tools to enhance each strategy. So how do you use digital tools to assess prior knowledge? Polling apps like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter are a way we've seen faculty assess student knowledge and determine how to adjust course delivery to better support student learning. Graphic organizers are also useful for prior knowledge assessment, such as Miro, WordMint, and Gitmind. Nearpod or Hypothesis are tools for students to interact with instructors' posted information and to respond. And that way you get a sense of their comprehension in real time as they respond to the information posted. And then peer interviews are another way to assess knowledge, while also including the positive community building practice of peer-to-peer interaction. Students pair up, they take turns interviewing each other about their understanding of the upcoming material. And so throughout all of these assessment practices, students are intentionally guided to center their identities, lived experiences, and cultural backgrounds into their concept maps, peer interviews, and all these assignments and assessments. And the instructor gets to know them as learners and gets to know them as their authentic selves as they're learning the disciplinary context.
So what you see here is also referenced in the guide. And so we really want to think about how do we become reflexive practitioners versus just reflecting on our practices. And so we have these cause to wonder and pause and reflect questions throughout the guide. And so this gives faculty members and educators an opportunity to really start thinking about their own teaching practices, interrogating those practices, thinking about who my practices are working for, but more importantly, who my practices might not be working for based off of their cultural identities and their lived experiences. And so we're going to have an activity here. We want to make sure that this is not just sit and get. We want to hear from you all as well. And so in our group activity, we've got some questions that we're going to ask, and Sarah's going to put those questions in the chat. And so we really want to think about how are you assessing students? What are your practices as it relates to assessing students? Also, how are you considering the different ways that students learn and engage with course content as you're thinking about those assessments and assignments? And so if you could, Sarah's going to put those in the chat. And so we have questions, and I'll start with the first question. So our first question is, what is your practice and approach to assessing prior knowledge? How does it take into consideration multiple ways of understanding the topic? And so in the chat, if you'll, you can also come off mute. And so I put the questions in the chat here. And so there's 3 different questions, and you don't have to answer all of those questions, but if you could just answer one of those questions, again, thinking about assessing prior knowledge and what that looks like in practice. And so you'll see those questions in the chat.
Also, if you're not in a position to type, please feel free to unmute or to raise your hand if you have a response to any of the questions. Okay, I see Dr. Natalie. Go ahead.
Oh, well, looking and listening to you all, I think just getting the students to begin a conversation, to hear what they have to say, to let them know that their voice is important. So I know a lot of times we do use apps such as Nearpod or Manometer and different things in the LSM platforms, but sometimes just hearing their voices and letting them know that we hear them, that we respect them, just by listening to them before we qualify any thoughts or um, any type of message that, instruction that we want to give to them. Is just acknowledging them first.
Thanks, Dr. Delbridge, for that. When we think about culturally responsive teaching and learning, it is really important to create space and center the student's voice in that space, to not have these preconceived notions about what students might know or what they don't know. So I really appreciate that.
Don't be scared. I'm scared. We can't talk. Let's get the camp talk.
We've got a few things in the chat. So Mohammed mentioned he uses a Google form to prepare the assessment in the form of multiple options, and he rarely allows
Dr. McQueen, you had a young man. You had a young man. See you yesterday.
Thank you. Okay. And then we have Sharonda said she administers a pretest to assess math background. Tanisha said she uses bell ringers to activate prior knowledge, which leads into the lesson. I think that's really cool. I'm curious to see what do you mean by bell ringers, if you wouldn't mind sharing more. Curious about that phrasing. Other folks are saying they may open up with their own example in a discussion to model and set the tone for whatever the topic is. And I have Kristen says I have students who create meditation to allow students to convey concepts in creative ways. That's really cool. Really cool. So a lot of great examples in the chat. I'll pass it back to you.
Dr. Ragland, I appreciate what you said about co-teaching with students. It's also important, right? And I know she had to move to another meeting, so thank you for that.
Yes, you're welcome. I just heard you, but I'm about to move to another
Okay.
meeting that's just starting. But yes, I believe in co-teaching. I believe what you said, students bring their experiences, their knowledge to the classroom. And we need to consider all that they bring, not what we have, but as a collaborative approach to teaching,
Great. Thank you for
Thank you
that.
so much.
That's one example of how you can democratize the classroom, is to actually co-teach with your students. And then you level the playing field so that the positionality is that you're actually teaching in a community and you're partnering with the students. And so that's great. Thanks. All right. Any final thoughts about assessment and how we can engage students' prior knowledge? There's some great examples in the chat, so hopefully you all can use those in your teaching practices. All right, and so if we can go back to the presentation.
Hey. Getting there. One moment, please. Okay. I was trying to share my screen. There we go. Okay, I think we're back on. Does everyone see the screen?
Thanks.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, we
Okay,
can
great.
see. So our next strategy is empowering students by using cultural references. And this approach really is about how we holistically engage students and center their multi-faceted aspects of who they are and their own identities and lived experiences in the classroom space. And so faculty who utilize this approach generally challenge the status quo. The other thing is that they also must be intentional about educating themselves around the cultures, historical and linguistic identities of the students, so that they can really make those connections to the disciplinary content and be intentional about incorporating these aspects in their teaching practices, so the students can really relate this to their own lived experiences and to real world experiences as it relates to the course content. Faculty must also be committed to creating these learning spaces and experiences that reflect students' identities, again, that honors who they are, honors their contributions as they are racialized groups, and thinking about how we can bring this into our course content so that the course content is really relevant to students and that they can make meaning of this through their own cultural lens. And so the other piece, and we just talked about this, if we'll go to the next slide, Sarah, we also talked about student voice. And so really, how are we engaging the student voice? How do we get student feedback? We really want to be able to do that through some student surveys. And so one way to do that is do surveys, small surveys throughout the semester. And it could just be like 2 or 3 questions. And getting feedback on how they're experiencing the course, how they're experiencing the teaching and learning experience, and also the course content and curriculum. And so one of the things that you see here, we have quotes throughout the guide from students. So we want to make sure that the student perspective is present. And so this is from Renee, who was one of our ATD fellows last year. And so she did some research for us and also was able to meet with faculty members and talk about, her experience in the classroom and how are they being culturally responsive as it relates to their own teaching practices. And so her quote here says, "Centering culture is an important part of decolonizing the curriculum and being more inclusive of different experiences that different cultures bring. And so again, for her to have a great experience in that class, to really feel like she belongs, that her identities are being centered, we really want to think about our curriculum and what does that look like for those students who don't hold dominant identities, and how are we being intentional, like she said, in decolonizing the curriculum, making it more inclusive of all diverse perspectives and all the students that are in the classroom space. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so then we want to think about how do we put things into practice? And so within the guide, you'll see these practical steps of how you put culturally responsive teaching and learning into practice. And so one is really recognizing and acknowledging the specific cultural characteristics of your diverse students, thinking about their diverse perspectives and experiences, and then how is that represented in the course content and the curriculum? And so we often talk about getting to know our students and what does that look like in practice. And so for myself, I like to really spend time with students before and after class, just getting to know them, asking them simple questions about, how was your weekend? Finding out where they work. What is that work experience like for them? Is this part of their career trajectory, or is this just, a job that's helping them maintain some financial responsibilities while they're taking classes? But really getting to know them and being able to use those cultural references that they share to also engage them in the curriculum and the course content. And then giving students opportunities really to expand their own worldview and explore and examine global topics, course content that's really specific to the discipline, but also making sure that it's culturally relevant, and then embedding those cultural references into the course content to make learning more accessible for students.
Okay, now we are going to engage further in the strategy of empowering students by using cultural reference. So here's another cause to wonder, pause, and reflect that's taken from the guide. And we will put a link to Jamboard in the chat. And then you could add sticky notes on your own, or feel free to unmute or add your responses into chat. And we'll give you some time to work independently, and then we'll share the results and have a group discussion. So the questions on Jamboard will be, what do you know to be meaningful and relevant to the students in your course? And how can you use this information to foster an understanding of course content and create assignments and activities that engage their sociocultural knowledge? Okay, so do we have the Jamboard?
Yes,
Yes.
I put it in the
Oh, wonderful.
chat,
Thank you.
so
I see it now.
hopefully folks will be able to click it.
Okay, and then I have the questions in there too, in the chat.
Great.
Do you see the Jamboard now in the share?
Yes, I'm able to see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. From speaking with your students and engaging in assignments, what have you known to be meaningful and relevant to students in your course? What are some examples that we can share here? And as you click to the next one, how would you ever, have you ever used this information to foster an understanding of course content and create assignments and activities that have engaged students' cultural assets, students' cultural wealth, students' cultural knowledge?
Hopefully folks are able to add their own stickies. I added mine back from my training and development days. I know that folks really appreciate being able to work and collaborate outside of just doing group projects, similar to race sentiment about learning about your colleagues and learning about the students in your class.
Would anyone like to come off of mute and share what kinds of discussions you have with your students that are meaningful that you then bring into your assignments?
Yeah, I guess I could sort of jump in here. So I teach French at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. And one of the things I really enjoy doing is incorporating pop culture elements into what I am teaching. So at that time, I lead an oral skills development class. And we brought in a topic that was, I guess, sort of a hot topic, right? It was, Love is Blind. And the hot topic of that specific week, was one of the persons in the show's mom or dad. They were having a discussion as a divorced couple, and so it was such a really hot topic to discuss. And yeah, the engagement for that specific class was quite high because it was obviously an out of class sort of experience that was brought into class and sort of dissected in a sort of academic setting. So that was really, really successful. And I guess evidence of it that they internalized it was that it came out during one of our assessments, as something that we had discussed in class. And I thought that was definitely a win-win on both of our parts because it's something I enjoyed, something they enjoyed, something we all enjoyed discussing in French.
Great example. Thank you. Would anyone like to comment on that or on any of your colleagues' Jamboard posts, or anybody would like to get off of mute and comment on your own and share a little bit more? Because as we heard when Brendan shared, hearing those specific examples is inspiring to try to do similar things in our own courses.
I will say that's a great actually idea, Brendan. I actually was a French teacher as well, but I don't not currently, but I actually used to teach adults, and one of the activities I used to incorporate was pop culture as well, but it was actually music videos. So I would play a music video and then I would have them guess like what they thought it was about, and then I would give them the lyrics, and then I would have them work with a partner to kind of decipher what it was, and then we would watch it again after we discussed like what it was actually about. So it was a nice way to kind of tie non-necessarily academic work, pop culture references, but being able to kind of use it in an academic way. So, but I feel like Love is Blind, that was a great way to incorporate pop culture.
Yes, and thank you. And we will be sharing the Jamboard as well with you. So
Let's continue talking a little bit. I see some really great ideas in here on what do you know to be meaningful and relevant to students. And so one person mentioned incorporating contemporary literature that from African and African American cultures. And so again, how do we bring in that course content that's relevant to students, but also meaningful to them as well? And so I really appreciate that. And then someone mentioned being open to students' responses that do not fit the norm, and really creating those spaces where we're not upholding those dominant values or norms, but allowing students then to have a choice for certain assignments. And so again, giving students agency um, to share their learning in ways that are meaningful to them as well. And then someone mentioned using the latest technology tools to help students demonstrate their learning in creative ways such as videos. This is really great information, folks.
and the person who put students value the incorporation of contemporary literature that values African and African American culture. I'm curious what course you teach. It could sound obvious, but I'm wondering if it maybe isn't the obvious. If you care to share. Oh, Comp 1 and Comp 2. Okay. Also, like literature of, diverse of perspectives of African American perspectives and Indigenous perspectives, Latinx perspectives. Of course, that could also be incorporated into all disciplines. So great. Let's peek at the next one. I'm not sure if we'll have enough time, but let's see. Okay, we do have a couple of responses here. How can you use this information to foster an understanding of course content and create assignments and activities that engage students' cultural knowledge? Creating community of learners who can engage with content in ways that are culturally meaningful to them. And I incorporate the literary genre of Afrofuturism to teach students rhetorical moves. Would anybody like to, those are both really interesting. Would anyone like to share those a little further? Does everyone see the second Jamboard slide?
No, we don't see that, Sarah.
You don't? I'm sorry.
Kristen, you had something you want to share, Dr. Fong?
Sure. I'm the person who put up the fact that I use Afrofuturism, the genre of literature, Afrofuturism, to teach rhetorical moves. I have students that are international students from Africa, and I teach at an HBCU. And we use short stories that are in that genre to actually to also integrate AI, and we debate the AI, generative AI, on how different rhetorical moves are used, how they're compared in multiple short stories. And we do it after we've debated it out in class, and then we compare what it said to what we've said, and we ask it, okay, well, how could we have expressed this differently? What different move could we have used here? And so we use it to build digital literacy, as well as engage in the specific cultural points that they value and that they want respect to be shown in a very contemporary way. This is not just a historical piece of history. We are a contemporary people that are engaged in a technological future.
Great, thank you. It's really, I appreciate you bringing in AI. As you know, that's a hot topic at this point. And so really getting your students to be critical thinkers about how AI is generating content. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so thank you all for engaging in that activity. I know that we are really close to time, and so we want to make sure that we have time to wrap up. Are there any questions or comments that folks have as it relates to the topic that we discussed today?
We do have some comments in the chat, or questions in the chat, I rather. So what consideration is or should be given in terms of students' diverse linguistic backgrounds? That's a great question. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I might answer that question. I think it's really important in thinking about Dr. Tara Yoso's work around community cultural wealth and how are we making sure that we affirm and validate that community cultural wealth that students bring into the space. And I know at my previous institution, one of my colleagues, she was taking some classes at the institution and was really nervous about taking a biology course, kind of based off of the reputation of the department. And so um, she was a Latinx student, and her professor was Latinx, and so he actually let those students speak in their native language in the classroom. He was actually speaking and engaging those students. He spoke Spanish as well. And so he used that as an opportunity to really help students understand the discipline content and concepts in their own language. And that experience for that particular student and the students in that classroom really changed their experience in this biology course, where they were able to engage and make meaning of course content in ways that were relevant to them. And that experience, like the student literally said, I'm going to go to this class the first night, and if this doesn't work out well, I'm gonna withdraw from the course. The student stayed in the course and most likely earned an A, but just really being able to create a space where students could be their authentic selves, bring in the authentic linguistic backgrounds. And how do we do better by our students that way? And how do we, if we are Spanish speakers or if we're speaking those students' native languages, how do we make sure we bring those languages into the classroom space and they're able to engage with their peers through their own first language as well?
Yeah, I really like, thanks, Ray. And I really liked an example of a nursing faculty member who had, students were invited to do their presentation in Spanish. And then, they did it in Spanish for the whole class, and then they also explained in English. So it was more like the whole presentation was in their language, that their primary language, and then it was explained in the secondary language, and it was a great learning experience. So
Great.
looks like there's other questions in the chat.
I think there was a response to that question as well, Dr. Fung. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Wonderful. So Sarah,
Looks like good. Looks like we're at time, and so we're gonna wrap up.
fabulous. Yeah, so thank you all so much. And Sarah's gonna be putting up the last screen for you all to stick around and stay in touch. So we do have the space open until 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we've got about 10 more minutes before we formally close out. So if you want to stick around and have a conversation with your other colleagues from the institutions or with our presenters, thank you so much, Sarah and Ray, for today's presentation. I learned a lot and I thought this was really great. Everyone will be getting the deck as well as the guides that they mentioned and the
I will
Jamboard.
put I'm sorry, Geneva.
Oh, yeah,
I will put the link to the culturally responsive teaching and learning guide right now into the chat as well.
Great, fabulous. And then we'll send that out later this week as well so that you can have a harder copy of it via email. But yeah, so if you wouldn't mind taking some time to just complete our evaluation, you can either take a screen grab of the QR code, or actually the QR code will lead you to our LinkedIn page where you can just go to the link right there. Kiriako's put it into the chat for you all to log in and complete the evaluation. It's pretty brief, but as I mentioned earlier, it does help us guide and frame how these webinars go and how we can enhance them moving forward. So your feedback is greatly appreciated. And then if you want to get in touch with us at UNCF, you can email our Teaching and Learning Center. So that's tlcenter@uncf.org, or you can get in touch with me or Kiyako directly, and you see our email addresses on the screen. And then lastly, always join us on LinkedIn. That's where we continue our conversation. So you'll be able to see the video of this webinar posted later this week. And then you'll also have the opportunity to chat with your colleagues via the comment section on LinkedIn as well. So we greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate your time today. We know that it's a wild time and a wild season for all of our professionals because it is the end of the academic year. So kudos to you for making it this far. And we hope that you enjoyed today's session. Thank you. Lots of kudos in the chat. So I do want to elevate that of excellent presentation and great tools for engagement. Thank you, Paul. Good to see you.